Whether you are on an adventure or at the downtown cafe, your answers are no more than a sniff away. Dog Training 360's purpose is simple: to teach you why dogs do what they do, as well as the action steps you need to take to have better communication, connection, consistency, and conceivability with your dog. So this is Rebecca and Joe, and we are talking dogs. And our topic today is tools for training dogs and the things that we hear all the time from a trainer's perspective and also from an owner perspective, of some of the myths that we've broke, but also just some of the things that even you, Rebecca, have found like aha moments with it, or things that you haven't liked and that type of thing. So we're just going to really kind of dive deep into talking about tools and just your perspective as a dog owner training your dogs to the nth degree.
Great.
So as far as, we talked last time about Austin's story, and I think that we went through every tool that's out there as much as we could to change the picture for him. Can you tell me just right off the top, like, what's your favorite tool, if you will, to use with training and then just general connection with your dogs?
That's a tough question. My favorite tool, I guess I would have to just right off the bat say the leash. To create connection.
Yeah. Do you feel like the leash is a negative thing?
No, I don't feel like it's a negative thing.
Do you feel like at times that that any of your dogs have reacted negatively to the leash?
Oh, definitely. Yes. Austin is the perfect example, like we talked about last week.
Yeah.
For sure. Yes.
In what way?
Well, I maybe wasn't to the leash. I mean, it wasn't like I would get out the leash and Austin would decompensate. It was more like when he was specifically on leash.
Yep.
Was when I had the most difficulties with his behavior.
Yeah.
And when he was off leash, if there were no other dogs around, he was perfectly fine and sweet and easy to manage. And if there were other dogs around, a lot of the time he was great. Social and fine.
Yeah. I think that sometimes we get caught up in allowing, freedoms, if you will, getting caught up in just the simple fact that the leash is on, and that the dogs should be allowed to be free, or maybe a little bit more organic or natural, or, whatever word we want to come up with. Is there a time that you feel or have ever felt for you as an owner that the leash is too confining and too difficult to deal with?
I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're getting at, but I do find with both of my current dogs, the Border Terrier and the German Shepherd, that in some circumstances they are certainly more, I guess I would say, respectful and connected to me without the leash.
Yeah.
Even though I originally said I like the leash for connection.
Yep.
But certainly now that they're both trained to the leash and they kind of have the leash as a tool that they are used to, then in certain circumstances like more wild circumstances, either on hikes or out in fields, if they're on leash, I feel like I lose the connection, actually.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what you were
Yep.
you were getting at. Yeah.
So sometimes the leash becomes more of a crutch to both of us, between our dog and the human, because the dog can feel you, so then they're disconnecting and paying attention to things out there because the leash keeps them connected.
Yes.
And so, you know, I understand how people feel like the leash is kind of a bother, if you will, because you do lose some of that connection, that organic or that real connection, or the authentic connection with your dog.
Yes.
Do you feel like that it's hard to transition off of the leash to going, you know, completely off leash with them?
At this point in both of their education, no, I don't find that is. If like on a daily basis, is that what you're asking?
Yep.
Yeah, no. I could easily have them on leash, be in an off leash appropriate scenario, take the leash off, and it's fine.
Yeah. So what do you feel like your dependency looks like with the leash? Like, how does the leash make you feel versus off leash?
I think it depends a little bit on the scenario.
Okay.
So if, for example, we're in like a downtown environment, a city type environment, or a store maybe type environment, then I feel like the leash it is necessary in those scenarios. Usually it's the law or the expectation of the store.
Yeah.
But it's also gives me the freedom, if you will, to know that my dog is safe. It's not going to get run over by a car by running off the sidewalk, you know, or by something surprising happened, unexpected happened, and I can negotiate traffic by myself, you know,
right,
sidewalk traffic or that kind of thing myself.
Yep.
And then on the flip side of that, if I'm in a non-leash appropriate situation, like out in the fields or on a hike or something, it's actually the opposite.
Yeah.
In some ways. I feel that the leash creates something that leads my dogs, at least, to be less resourceful. And so I just need to get them off leash, and then they connect back into me, and I feel like they're actually safer that way.
Yeah. And what I'm getting at is into just a little bit deeper of this whole thing, but we talk about this leash being more of a tool, not something that we have to have on our dog. And that's why I'm swinging between off leash and on leash, is sometimes we get so fixated on the leash that then the dog gets fixated on the leash, and they don't know what to do if they're off leash, and so they completely disconnect because the owners are so fixated on leash that they're terrified for the dog to be off leash, because it's something that becomes a dependency, not a tool to continue the progression of training to set your dog up to be successful. Do you feel like there was ever a time that you felt like leash was like the umbilical cord, if you will, like this, there's no other thing that can keep my dogs connected into me and through training and all of that?
I can't remember a time that I felt that way. Do you remember a time that I expressed
no
that? Okay. No, not exactly.
Yeah. So Rebecca, let's, as we talk about, you know, the leash, and I feel like it's it's a tool that everybody, like, you have a dog and you have a leash, like that's just a thing.
Yes.
All the other tools come secondary to having a leash. I mean, some people don't even, you know, put the collars on, they just have the slip leads or, you know, whatever. So it's, this leash is like, that's the connection to everything else out there.
Yes.
As far as tools go. And one thing that's been super fun in our journey of training is that you've never looked at the leash any other way other than it's a tool. Sometimes we have to have it on them because the law states that we have to have them on it. Sometimes it's a safety thing. Sometimes it's a training thing. But at the end of the day, the dogs are on a leash and they know that with this tool, there's some kind of connection. And this really holds true to a situation that you and Anne were in, where you were both hit by a car and completely knocked unconscious, and you had the two dogs, and they stayed with you. Like, there was that somewhere inside, you still had a hold of the leash, and
yes.
and they could have easily pulled away from you.
Yes.
And so that leash really became your guys' lifeline to survival, if you will, in the big scheme of things.
I agree with that statement. Yes.
And so I think it's important to, you know, as we talk about leash stuff, that the leash is the most important tool, and it's also the least important tool if it's used correctly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I that rings true with my experience.
So as we move down the list as far as tools, what's your next favorite?
I think I honestly have to say the e-collar.
Yeah. And why is that?
Well, with the 3 dogs, well, actually 4 dogs that I've worked with you, I've used it in a variety of different scenarios, and they've all been different, and it's always been very successful as the first preface to it. And then the second preface to it, or the second component of why I like it so much, is that it has allowed me, in whatever scenario, which we'll, I'm sure, get into some detail later, but it's allowed me to be able to be a little bit relaxed with the dogs, and still have some ability to have a safety and control in different scenarios.
So what do you feel like the difference between the e-collar and the leashes?
Good question. It's I think 2 things for me. It's quite easy for me to give a stimulation on the e-collar precisely, meaning the timing is precise, and I can regulate the intensity of the stimulation precisely in a way that I personally have difficulty doing with the leash. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is the dog can make its own decisions because it's not connected to me with a piece of cloth. So it can kind of make its own decisions, and then I can either correct those decisions quickly and in a way that feels right to me in terms of intensity and precisely.
In a sense, it's just this invisible leash that's got better timing.
Yeah.
and more precise of a stimulation. And what have you heard, and what's the backlash and the negative side of e-collars?
Well, I definitely encountered questions from acquaintances and friends, and the questions have been sort of coming from a negative perspective. So I didn't know anything about e-collars before I started using them, so I never had a negative perspective on them. But my interpretation of the questions that I get is that people believe that they are an inhumane form of a shock, that you're shocking your dog, and that it hurts them, and that they don't understand it, and it's harsh harmful.
Yep. And if we compared that, and there's not a right or a wrong tool to use. It just depends on the circumstances and the dog. And there's a lot of trainers out there that don't believe that, don't have that philosophies. But what do you feel like the similarities are between a leash and collar? We're not going to say corrective collar or anything, but a leash and collar and an e-collar with a remote. What do you feel like the similarities are?
Okay. Oh gosh, how to say it? Just I honestly feel like it's a connection to the dog. I have a connection to the dog.
Okay. And what do you feel like the differences are?
Go ahead.
Yeah, from a negative standpoint.
Oh, from a negative standpoint. So with a leash, number one, as we both laugh about with Austin, when we think back on the times, it can be clumsy. Like I tripped over the leash with Austin so many times. I mean, I tripped over it. I fell on my butt. I had the leash going all over the place, whether it was a long line or a regular short leash. I got tangled in it with him. And I still have that experience. And if I am training on a long line, it's harder to keep my feet out from under it. So that's one thing with the leash that is absent with the e-collar. And the other thing with a leash that I find I am not able to, especially in scenarios with Austin, where he was very out of control and very unmanageable. With a leash and collar, I often felt I had to be extremely high, strong, aggressive with him in a way that I did not have to be with an e-collar.
So that emotion is different.
It is different.
And I think more the emotional side of things versus the actual physical things, because you have to get emotionally intense with a leash and collar, no matter what the dog is, versus an e-collar with a remote.
Yes,
you can kind of take the emotion out of that.
Yes, it is easy to do that with an e-collar.
And obviously, if it's taught right and done right, you don't just throw an e-collar on and hope for the best.
Right.
What do you feel like the similarities are between an e-collar and a head collar, if we're looking at it from the eyes of the general public, and they were handed these two tools, a head collar and an e-collar, and they picked the head collar over the e-collar because the e-collar appears much more aggressive and mean.
Mm-hmm.
But what's the similarities between the two?
They're both a means of communication with the dog.
Right. And how does the head collar communicate?
Just to clarify, by a head collar, describe what you mean by head collar.
Like the Halties and the gentle leaders.
Gentle leaders. Okay.
Yeah.
Both for me and for the people listening.
Uh-huh.
So your question is, how do the head collars communicate?
How are they similar in the communication if you look at them? If we look at the e-collar and go, man, that's fierce, and I don't want to put that on my dog, but I'm willing to put a head collar on my dog. How is the head collar, or how can the head collar be just as fierce as the e-collar, if you will? If we're just like, we're going to take it as the e-collars mean, how is the head collar mean?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I honestly don't feel competent to answer it because I've never used a head collar.
Yeah.
I've never even seen one other than on someone else's dog. So
right.
I don't know how they operate.
So just your appearance on other people's dogs. I'll talk about it from the training standpoint, but just from like you seeing other dogs on head collars versus how you feel about, your dogs walking next to you.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly appears to me that there's pressure on the dog's face and nose, and that the handler is using that pressure to direct the dog in a way that certainly, I mean, part of the reason I've never used one is because I was terrified if I put one on Austin, he would break his neck because he would just look around and I'd be holding his head in my hands. Yep. So I think depending on the dog, at least from my perspective, it looks like it could be quite uncomfortable at least and harsh.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you understand that, again, every tool there's good and there's bad to it. But what I'm hoping to do is to educate people on really digging in and understanding the tools that you're using, that they can all be fierce no matter how nice they look. And the one things with the head collars, where it came from is the halters on the horses. We gently lead the horses with the halters. It appears nice. I've seen some pretty fierce halters out there.
As have I.
And so it appears to be much more gentler, if you will, than putting a rope around the neck and leading the horse. And so when it gets into, we're dealing with a predator and a prey animal, and a predator uses their mouth for survival, and a predator doesn't always follow their head.
Right.
Where a prey, or a horse, if you will, where the halters came from and derived with the head collars, and that whole concept, is a horse will follow its head. It's not going to send its body in a different direction to get out of. It's going to give into the pressure.
That makes sense.
Where a predator wants to go away from the pressure. And so with the head collars, they battle this in their head because it teaches them to give pressure to the head collar, and somehow they have to learn to give to the pressure because that's the way the head collars are designed. And we're taking their main survival source away from them. Even though it's not a muzzle and it doesn't clamp down, you still have pressure on the top of that muzzle.
Yeah.
So it's a very dominant tool that appears much nicer than an e-collar would.
Yes.
And so I see some dogs that totally accept it, stick it on. They think that's just, this is part of life and it's walking, and, the owners are able to control the dog, keeping, the dog at their side and to not appear to be pulling as hard as if they would if they had a collar on around their neck. So if we move from a head collar onto a prong collar,
Yeah.
what is the similarities to a prong collar and a regular collar?
Well, they both fit around the dog's neck.
Yep.
And so the control of the dog through the leash is to the neck.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
It's just
similar.
different pressure.
Yeah.
So if we had a dog that was stronger than us and taking us for a walk, and it didn't matter if we had a slip collar, which we'll kind of get into a little bit too, or just a regular collar, putting a prong collar on a dog because they mentally and physically can handle it, or the owners need it to be able to physically handle it, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
How is it a bad thing? How can it be a bad thing?
Well, I guess if the handler or owner is if the dog mentally is not able to handle that much pressure, I guess, or if the owner handler is using it incorrectly. But in my personal experience with prong collars, I feel that I can exert far less pressure on the dog through the collar if I have a simple prong collar on.
Yeah.
So it feels like a much more gentle tool actually than a regular flat collar.
Yeah, and it changes you emotionally because you don't have to become as fierce against the regular collar.
Right.
And there's so much in all of these tools that play into how they affect us emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's a good.
And how that goes down the leash.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're frustrated with whatever tool you're using because your dog is not able to be connected to you and behave in a way that feels right for the scenario, then you're going to transmit that to the dog.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. So let's go on to a slip lead or a slip collar. It's all the same, whether it's a collar with a leash hooked on that's a slip. Old timers would call it a choke chain or a choke collar. And how is that similar to a prong collar?
It exerts in the same way that a prong collar can exert sort of a differentiated amount of pressure pretty easily depending on the tension in the leash. The slip collar can do that as well.
Right. And what's the challenging part to a slip collar or slip lead?
Well, for me, the challenging part is it's either like on or off in my experience.
Yeah.
And once I have dogs that are perfectly mannered and can feel and walk with a loose leash easily, then a slip lead works.
Yeah.
Because it's always loose.
Right.
But in my experience, when I'm training a dog, I have difficulty using it in a way that feels right to me because I feel like it's always on.
Yeah. It's hard to get that. The dog has to find that release, and it's hard to get it depending upon the strength of the dog and also how much they'll tolerate of pressure too. I find that difficult.
Yeah.
I like to say that there's a couple of, from a trainer standpoint with the slip lead, is this. When we're out with other people's dogs, I know that a slip lead or a slip collar is not going to malfunction on me at all. And so, and the dog can't get away from me.
Yeah.
And so,
like when you're walking other people's dogs, is that what you mean? Yeah.
Because I don't know necessarily what's going to trigger that dog to either become reactive or fearful and try and slip out of something. Or my prong collar is going to come undone or loose. You know, I've had some clients that are like, oh yeah, here's my prong collar, and like the prongs are pretty much coming undone already, and you're like, I don't feel comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And so from a trainer standpoint, it's the easiest go-to tool when training other people's dogs, because I'm there for repetition, consistency, and I can keep at it because that's my job. Where from an owner's perspective, you kind of just want to get out there and be able to walk your dog and fix and make those little corrections that you need to make the walk more enjoyable.
Yeah.
Or your leash experience more enjoyable. But on my own dogs, like Miss Caroline, she started on a regular collar, and then as she matured, she's on a prong collar now, and ultimately will go back to a slip lead after she understands the position that she needs to be on, and then ultimately she'll be on an e-collar, you know, in open country and off-leash stuff. And so there's a progression that you want to get to and work through so that you can come back to the easiest tool. And some people, that's a collar and leash, not having to put a slip lead on or anything.
Right.
And that should be everybody's goal, but using the tools to get what you need is important. I don't know, I can't remember, Rebecca, if we used like an Easy Walk harness or a no pull harness on Austin. Do you remember?
I had tried one. Those are the ones that go around the chest, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I had tried one before I met you, and it didn't work at all. And so I don't remember if you and I discussed it.
I mean, I know we didn't use it, but what didn't work for you?
Well, Austin was so strong.
Yeah.
He just had two modes, basically. Either he was fine, in which case I'm sure that harness type of setup worked. But when he was unmanageable, to me, having the leash connected to a harness at the strongest part of his body just dragged me around.
Yeah.
Like I had no control over him at all.
Yeah. Yeah, and then all of a sudden you're managing a body and not a head, I guess, if you will.
Yeah.
So the scenarios that I use, the no pull harnesses, there's a couple. With some of my smaller dogs that, like, their neck is the size of their head, or they're a breed that's prone to neck problems, like the King Charles Spaniels, or the pugs are really kind of difficult, or the Frenchies and the Bulldogs are hard to put collars or any kind of corrective collar on. And they're just little bowling balls anyway, that putting an Easy Walk harness on the front, because the biggest part of their body's in their chest, that you can turn them easier because the momentum helps you with that.
Yeah.
Where they don't really have the strength and the drive from the back end. And so that harness kind of takes their front end away from them.
I can see that.
And so those are some scenarios. The other scenario is I have quite a few families where the kids are responsible for walking the dog when they go home from school, and they've got everybody has their job with the dog. And kids, one, have a hard time staying consistent with training, because what's the point? We're just out for a walk. And also sometimes they have a hard time with even just the overall strength of holding on to the dog. And the dogs know. They're like, yep, this is the person that we pull. And so I put a no pull harness for the kids to walk the dog because it's not going to mess up any training that the mom is doing.
That makes sense.
And then it all just transfers and collides, and the dog walks nice with the kids because of the training that the mom's doing. And the harness just kind of helps reinforce what we're trying to do without messing anything up.
Yeah.
So those are the scenarios of the harnesses. I don't ever put just a regular harness on and use that for walking unless I have a dog that's got a medical problem and there's a reason why they have to have a harness on. And then the dog better be to a point of walking nice on a leash so that we just have the leash on there because it's the law.
Yeah.
And that we're not training with it. But it just, most harnesses just teach them to pull instead of really doing anything. You can pick them up and maneuver them in a lot of good ways, but it doesn't teach them anything other than to pull or put pressure on those pressure points.
Interesting.
So, Rebecca, are there any tools that we haven't talked about that you have used?
Let me think for a minute. Well, I guess we didn't really talk about like a long line versus a short line for a leash.
Yep.
And then I suppose some people would maybe put treats and rewards into the category of tools.
Yep. So we're going to leave out the treats and the clickers and that piece as tools because I like to call them motivators. Mm-hmm. And also they truly should not be connected to the tools that you're using.
Yeah.
And so when we talk next week, that we're going to have a pretty in-depth conversation about those things that we use to motivate that have nothing to do with the tools that we're putting on our dog.
Okay, great.
If you had to give pet owners out there advice as it relates to different tools and everything that you've studied and everything that you've progressed through, what would that advice be?
Use tools. With all of my dogs, through your help show and just independently, I've used all of the tools that we've talked about, even with my small 20-pound border terrier and even with my young, not yet 1-year-old German Shepherd. And I value them all. That's why your first question of what my favorite tool was difficult, because it truly for me depends on what the scenario is. And I leave the house every day with my dog and I think, okay, which tools do I need? And I grab a few different ones because most of the time I'm going to be at the barn, field, at a store, and I want different things in all of those places.
Yep, exactly. And they ultimately get to a point where you're just hooking on a leash and going, and then that's when you get the opportunity to find that or have that favorite leash. But until then, you have to be open to the process and understand that there's all different tools for all different scenarios for all different dogs, and to be open to it.
Yes.
As we wrap up our conversation on tools, I would just encourage everybody out there to ask the questions, ask, because just because it looks nice doesn't mean it's going to be nice on your dog.
Yeah, and to add on to that, ask, and if you're asking someone and they're either not, refusing to answer because they don't talk about that tool or don't use that tool, or they are only talking about the bad things associated with whatever tool you're talking about. Take their opinion, value what they're telling you, but find another source of information about it as well.
Yeah, I like that. I'm going to add into this podcast, a YouTube video of what's in my toolbox. And so everybody can visually listen to this and then watch the YouTube video on the different tools and what they're used for and how they're used. And hopefully that will just kind of collide together with our conversation and what's in my box. And Rebecca, if you have, when you have a moment, if you would do a video on what's in your toolbox, because it's going to be way different. Because I'm the trainer and you're the dog owner of many, and you have a lot in your toolbox, but if you'll share that as well, and then we'll merge those two together, and so that everybody can really kind of see the difference between two different, I guess, worlds of dogs.
Great.
Perfect. Okay, I have had fun talking dogs, and we will talk dogs next week.
Great. I've had fun too, and I can't wait for
next week. Sounds good.